The brooch was no larger than a shilling. A modest oval of garnets set in aged gold, the clasp worn smooth by decades of careful hands. To anyone else in that crowded London market, it was simply a pretty trinket half buried beneath a pile of tarnished buttons and broken lockets on a second-hand seller's cloth. Worth perhaps 2 shillings, perhaps 3. But Eleanor Voss knew the moment her fingers closed around it that it was worth far more than that. Not because of the garnets, not because of the gold, because engraved on the back, in letters so fine they required sunlight to read, were 2 words that made her breath stop entirely. For Margaret. She stood there in the middle of the market noise. Vendors calling, horses clopping on cobblestones, a child crying somewhere to her left, and she turned the brooch over and over in her palm. For Margaret. She had no way of knowing, not then, not standing there in her plain gray dress with her empty basket on her arm, that those 2 words would change her life completely. She had no way of knowing that Margaret was the name of a duchess, that the brooch had been missing for 11 years, that a woman of 63 had wept every anniversary of its loss with a grief her son could not fix with all his wealth and title. And she had no way of knowing that by the time the sun set that evening, the most feared duke in all of England would be standing in the doorway of her modest lodging house, staring at her as though she had done something no one in his memory had ever done before, something entirely without motive, something entirely without price. Eleanor Voss had simply done what was right, and that, in the world of Edward Ashworth, Duke of Cavendale, was the most extraordinary thing she had ever done. There were men in London who inspired admiration. Edward Ashworth inspired something else. At 35, he was the kind of man a room rearranged itself around. Not because he demanded it, he never demanded anything so vulgar as attention, but because something in his bearing communicated quietly and absolutely that the world would conform to him and not the other way around. He was tall, dark-haired, with the controlled stillness of a man who had learned very young that emotion was a liability. His eyes were gray, a particular shade of gray that reminded people of the winter sky just before snow, beautiful and entirely without warmth. He had been the Duke of Cavendale for 7 years, inheriting the title at 28 when his father died of a sudden fever. He had stepped into the role the way one steps into cold water, without flinching, without complaint, without ever once looking as though he wished it were otherwise. Society called him capable. His tenants called him fair. His solicitors called him exacting. His mother called him Edward, in a voice that held 11 years of quiet sorrow, and he always flinched slightly when she did, though he would never have admitted it. He had no wife. This was, in the year of our Lord 1849, considered something between a social inconvenience and a minor scandal. He was a duke. He had a title, 3 estates, and a duty to produce an heir. His mother reminded him of this with the gentle persistence of a woman who had long since abandoned expectation but refused to abandon hope. He had courted once, briefly, Lady Cecilia Hartfield, 7 years ago, a beautiful and accomplished young woman from an excellent family. The courtship had ended without explanation, without scandal, and without, as far as anyone could tell, any particular feeling on Edward's part at all. Since then, nothing. There were whispers, of course. There always were. That he was too cold to love. That some wound lay beneath the composure. That the Duke of Cavendale was a man who had decided, for reasons known only to himself, that the world would be kept at a precise and permanent distance. The whispers were not entirely wrong. The heroine, Eleanor Voss, was 24 years old and invisible. Not literally, she was present enough in the physical sense. Medium height, brown hair that refused to behave regardless of how carefully she pinned it. Eyes the color of dark honey that saw rather more than people expected, given that no one generally thought to look. She was the daughter of a country vicar who had died 3 years past, leaving her nothing but a modest education, a genuine love of books, and a character formed by watching a good man spend his entire life serving people who never quite noticed him. She was not beautiful in the way society counted beauty. She was not wealthy. She was not connected. She had no family left of consequence, only a distant cousin in Bristol who had offered, once with significant reluctance, the use of a spare room. Eleanor had declined. Instead, She had come to London and found work as a seamstress's assistant in a small shop on a quiet street in Holborn. It was honest work. It was sufficient. And Eleanor Voss, daughter of a vicar, was a woman who had been raised to find sufficiency something close to grace. She asked very little of the world. The world, in return, offered her very little. This was an arrangement she had made her peace with. Mostly, on the morning that everything changed, she had gone to the market on her half-day off, with 2 shillings in her pocket and a list of small necessities. Thread, a button, perhaps an orange if they were reasonable. She had not gone looking for anything remarkable. She had not gone looking for a brooch engraved for Margaret. But there it was. And there she was. And Eleanor Voss, unlike a great many people in that city, stopped. The brooch. To understand what happened next, you must first understand what the brooch meant. Margaret Ashworth, Dowager Duchess of Cavendale, had received it on her wedding day in 1807. Not from her husband, the late Duke had been a generous man, but his gifts ran to diamonds and formal presentation. The brooch had come from her own mother, pressed into her palm in the carriage on the way to the church. For courage, her mother had said. Asterisk, garnets for courage, and gold because love endures. Asterisk. Margaret had worn it every day for 30 years. She had worn it when her son was born, and when her daughter died in infancy, and when her husband breathed his last, and when Edward inherited the title and she saw something close behind in his eyes like a door locking quietly from the inside. She had lost it 11 years ago, an afternoon visiting the sick in the East End. She had always done charity work, quietly, without announcement, and somewhere between the carriage and the narrow stairs of a tenement building, the brooch had slipped from her collar. She had wept, truly wept, and Margaret Ashworth was not a woman given to weeping. Edward had searched. He had hired men to search. He had offered a reward that was never claimed. Eventually, because the world does not stop for grief, the search has ended. The brooch had been swallowed by London. Lost, or so they had believed. The return. Eleanor did not know, at first, who owned the brooch. She bought it for a penny, the seller having no idea of its value and being perfectly happy to be rid of it, and carried it home in her pocket, turning it over and over as she walked. The engraving troubled her. For Margaret. A gift. A personal, cherished gift. Not some estate trinket or decorative piece. This had been someone's. That evening, seated by her small window in the lodging house with the brooch in the lamplight, Eleanor examined the crest she had half noticed on the clasp. It took her the better part of an hour with a borrowed magnifying glass and a dog-eared copy of Burke's Peerage, which Mrs. Holt the landlady kept on her shelf for reasons she never explained, to find it. The crest belonged to the Duchy of Cavendale. Eleanor set the book down. She was a seamstress's assistant. The Duke of Cavendale was, she turned a page, Edward James Ashworth, 5th Duke of Cavendale, holder of Cavendale Park in Derbyshire, Ashworth House in London, and 3 further estates. She set the book down again. It would have been easy, then, to put the brooch in a drawer and pretend she had never found it. Easier still to sell it to a better second-hand dealer for perhaps 10 or 15 shillings, enough to keep her comfortable for a month. It was a small thing. No one would know. Eleanor knew. She spent exactly 1 night thinking about it, which is to say she spent exactly 1 night not sleeping. By morning, the decision was made. It had probably been made the moment she saw the engraving. For Margaret, someone had loved this object. Someone had lost it. And Eleanor Voss was her father's daughter in the most inconvenient possible way. She wrote the letter that morning in her neatest hand on the best paper she owned, which was not very good paper at all, being slightly gray and of inconsistent weight. She addressed it to Ashworth House. She explained simply that she had come upon a piece bearing the Cavendale crest at a market, that she believed it might be of personal significance to the family, and that she would be happy to return it at their convenience. She gave her address at the lodging house. She sent the letter. Then she went to work and tried not to think about it further. The Duke receives a letter. Ashworth House received perhaps 300 letters a week. Most were addressed to Edward's secretary, Mr. Fenn, who sorted them into categories of urgency with the efficiency of a man who had been sorting letters for 15 years. Business, social engagements, charitable requests, items requiring the Duke's personal attention. The letter from a Miss E. Voss of Holborn arrived on a Tuesday morning and landed, by pure accident of timing, directly in front of Edward himself as he passed through the entrance hall. Fenn had dropped the Morning Post. Edward picked up the letter. He nearly handed it back unread. Then something, the address, perhaps, or the weight of the paper, so clearly not the paper of someone accustomed to writing to dukes, made him open it. He read it twice. Then he stood very still in the middle of his entrance hall for a moment that his butler, Graves, would later describe as notable, which from Graves, a man of magnificent understatement, meant that it had clearly been something significant indeed. "Have the carriage prepared," Edward said finally. "Your Grace," Graves said, surprised. "You have the Harrington meeting at 11. Move it." Edward was already folding the letter. "I'll be in Holborn." Graves moved it. First meeting. Eleanor was not at the lodging-house when the Duke's carriage arrived. She was at work. She returned at 5:30 to find Mrs. Holt in a state of electrified agitation at the foot of the stairs, her cap askew and her hands pressed together in the manner of a woman who had received a shock and found it not entirely unpleasant. "There was a gentleman," Mrs. Holt said, dragging the word out to extraordinary length, "in a carriage, a very fine carriage. He asked for you by name." Eleanor's heart did something irregular. "Did he leave a card?" Mrs. Holt pressed one into her hands with the reverence of a woman handing over a holy relic. Eleanor looked at it. Edward Ashworth, Duke of Cavendale. The card was of a quality that made her own letter paper seem faintly embarrassing in retrospect. "He said," Mrs. Holt continued, her voice dropping to the volume she reserved for very important information, "that he would return tomorrow at 10 o'clock, and he had very serious eyes." Eleanor stood there looking at the card. "Very serious eyes," Mrs. Holt repeated meaningfully. Eleanor went upstairs and did not sleep again. The following morning, she dressed with care. There was not much to be done about the gray dress. It was her best and it was still plain, but she pressed it, pinned her hair neatly, and sat in the small parlor that Mrs. Holt had insisted upon offering for the occasion, perched on the edge of a chair with the brooch in a small folded handkerchief in her lap. At precisely 10 o'clock, Graves knocked. The Duke of Cavendale filled the parlor doorway in a way that had nothing to do with physical size, though he was tall. It was something in how he stood, contained, precise, as though he occupied exactly as much space as he had decided to occupy and not a fraction more. He looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at him. She had not expected him to be young. Dukes, in her limited experience of them, tended to be elderly and florid. This man was neither. He was. She filed the observation away and tried not to let it show on her face. Quite disconcertingly composed. "Miss Voss." His voice was low and even. "Your Grace." She rose, remembered to curtsy, and managed it without incident. "Please sit." He sat. She sat. The parlor, which had seemed adequate moments ago, felt suddenly very small. "You found something," he said. Not a question. "Yes." Eleanor opened the handkerchief. The garnets caught the morning light. Small, dark red. Alive. She held it out to him. Edward Ashworth looked at the brooch, and something happened in his face. It was slight, barely a shift. The kind of change that only registered if you were watching carefully, and Eleanor, being her father's daughter, was always watching carefully. Something in the gray eyes loosened. A tension she hadn't known was there until it eased. He reached out and took the brooch from her palm. His fingers were careful. More careful, she thought, than a man of his bearing might have been expected to be with something so small. "Where did you find it?" he asked. She told him. The market. The pile of buttons and old lockets. The penny she'd paid. He turned the brooch over. "Read the engraving on the back." Something moved through his expression. She couldn't have named it. And then the composure returned, smooth and complete. "This belonged to my mother," he said. "I thought it must be personal," Eleanor said. "The engraving. It was a gift from her own mother. On her wedding day." A pause. "She has mourned its loss for 11 years. Eleanor felt something in her chest settle. Good, she thought. That's why it mattered. "I'm glad it can be returned to her," she said simply. Edward looked at her then. truly looked, as though what she had said required examination. You could have sold it, he said. Yes. The garnets alone would have brought several shillings. Yes. Why didn't you? Eleanor considered the question. It seemed to her to have a very straightforward answer. Because it wasn't mine, she said. It belonged to someone. I could see that. The engraving was… She paused, searching for the right word. Personal. Someone had loved it. It seemed wrong to profit from someone's loss. Silence. How much did you pay for it? He asked. A penny, Eleanor said, and then immediately regretted it because it sounded, somehow, both too small and too complicated. Edward reached into his coat and produced his card case. He laid it open on the table beside her teacup. Beside the card was something else. A folded note. I would like to offer a recompense, he said. Eleanor looked at the note without touching it. That isn't necessary, Your Grace. It is to me. I didn't return it for payment. She said it quietly but very clearly. I returned it because it was right. Another silence. This one was different, less formal, more curious. I see, said the Duke of Cavendel. He picked the note up and returned it to his coat. He sat for a moment with the brooch held in both hands, looking at it. And Eleanor, watching him, saw something she had not expected to see in the face of the most feared duke in England. He looked, for just a moment, like someone who had been relieved of a weight he had carried for a very long time. My mother will want to thank you, he said finally. Eleanor shook her head. That really isn't. She will insist. Something that was almost amusement crossed his face. My mother is not a woman who takes no for an answer. I warn you, Miss Voss, she will consider this a debt and she will repay it. I have been trying for 35 years to stop her from doing things like this, and I have never once succeeded. Eleanor blinked. Then, before she could help it, she laughed. A small, surprised sound. Edward Ashworth looked at her as though she had done something unexpected. As though laughter in that small parlor was a thing that had startled him entirely. I'll call on her tomorrow if she wishes, Eleanor said, composing herself. Please tell her I hope the brooch brings her comfort. Edward rose. He inclined his head, a gesture of courtesy more genuine than anything he'd offered in the formal rooms of his own world. Good day, Miss Voss. Good day, Your Grace. He left. Eleanor sat for a moment in the small parlor, listening to the carriage pull away. Then she looked down at her hands in her lap. Her heart, she noticed, was still behaving irregularly. She told it firmly to stop. Margaret Ashworth was everything her son was not. She was small, warm, quick to smile, slow to forget, and possessed of an energy that made rooms feel inhabited rather than merely occupied. She had dark hair gone silver, eyes that were gray like Edward's but with none of the winter in them. Hers were the gray of morning, full of the expectation of sun. When Eleanor arrived at Ashworth House the following day, she was met not by a butler and a formal reception room, but by the Dowager Duchess herself, who had apparently been watching for the carriage from the upstairs window and descended at a pace that Graves, clearly, considered to be a hazard. Miss Voss. Margaret Ashworth took both her hands at once, the way Eleanor's own mother used to, and held them with a warmth that made Eleanor's throat tighten unexpectedly. Come in, come in. I've been awake since 5 thinking about this. Edward told me everything. Eleanor was ushered into a sitting room that was, unlike the rest of Ashworth House, actually comfortable. Full of worn cushions and books left open and flowers from someone's garden arranged without any formal intention in a blue vase. A room where someone lived rather than resided. The brooch was already on the table between them, and returned to its rightful place. Margaret sat across from her and looked at the brooch for a long moment. Her hands were folded in her lap. When she looked up, her eyes were bright. My mother's hands put this on my collar on my wedding morning, she said quietly. She died the following year. This is all I had left of her. Eleanor felt the words land with the particular weight of grief recognized. I'm so sorry, she said. I know what it is to lose something that was the last connection to a person. Margaret looked at her. Sharp, warm eyes, eyes that saw things. Your father. Eleanor nodded. 3 years ago. He was a vicar. He had very little to leave, but what he left mattered. It always does, Margaret said. Objects are strange things. We dismiss them as mere things, and then the person is gone and suddenly the object is a door. She touched the brooch gently. This was my door. I thought it was lost forever. A pause. Then, where did you find it? Eleanor told her. The market, the penny, the engraving. Margaret listened with complete attention. When Eleanor finished, she was quiet for a moment. You could have kept it, she said. Your Grace. No. I want to know. You could have kept it. No one would ever have known. Why didn't you? Eleanor looked at her hands, then back at the Duchess. Because I knew, she said. And that was enough. Margaret Ashworth's expression changed. It was not a dramatic change. It was the change of a woman who has been looking for something for a very long time and has just, unexpectedly, found it. She pressed her hand over Eleanor's and held it. My dear, she said softly. My dear child. Eleanor felt the tears begin to threaten, entirely unreasonably, and blinked them away. I would like to see you again, Margaret said. Not as an obligation, not as repayment. Simply, I would like to know you, Miss Voss, if you're willing. Eleanor looked at this woman who had every reason to dismiss her, every social right to receive the brooch with a formal thank you and a bank note, and thought nothing more of it. And instead she was here, in her worn-cushioned sitting room, holding a seamstress's assistant's hand as though they were old friends. I would like that, Eleanor said. Very much. 3 weeks. Over the following 3 weeks, Eleanor visited Ashworth House twice a week. She did not see the Duke. She was aware that she did not see the Duke. She was also aware that she was aware, which was uncomfortable in a different way entirely. Margaret did not mention her son very often. When she did, it was with the careful, practiced lightness of a woman who loved someone deeply and had learned to measure out that love in small, manageable doses because the full weight of it was more than the recipient could receive. He was different as a child, she said once over tea. Not easy, he was never easy, but warmer, more present. He used to follow me around the garden asking the names of every flower. A pause. After his father died, something closed. I've never quite found the door. Eleanor thought of what she had seen in the entrance hall the day of his first visit. That moment when he had read the engraving. The way the composure had shifted, just briefly, like snow disturbed by wind. Perhaps, she said carefully. The door is still there. Margaret looked at her, and something played in her expression. Something knowing and maternal and very slightly dangerous. Perhaps, she agreed. It was on the 4th visit that she saw him. She had arrived slightly early. The bus from Holborn ran fast that morning, and Graves, departing from his usual immaculate protocol, had shown her to the library rather than the sitting room. Margaret would be down shortly, he said. Would she like tea? Eleanor said she would and looked around the library. It was extraordinary. Shelves from floor to ceiling, a rolling ladder, afternoon light falling across a Persian carpet, the smell of old books and wood polish, 2 chairs by the fireplace, a desk in the corner, a man at the desk. She did not immediately realize it was the Duke. He had his back partially to her, his coat off, his sleeves rolled up, a pen in his hand, a stack of papers beside him that suggested he had been working for some hours. He looked, without the coat and the formal bearing, somewhat less like a duke and somewhat more like a person. He heard her enter and turned. Their eyes met. Miss Voss. He rose. Not hastily. He never did anything hastily, but with an immediacy that suggested the action had been deliberate rather than obligatory. Your Grace. I'm sorry. I was shown in early. No matter. He gestured to the chairs by the fire. My mother won't be long. Please sit. Eleanor sat. He sat across from her, which was... She had not expected that. She had expected him to return to his desk. Pause not unfriendly. How is your work? He asked. She looked up, surprised. He had asked as though the answer interested him. It's well, thank you. We have had a great deal of orders coming in for the season. Do you enjoy it? The sewing itself, yes. I find it satisfying. Like... She paused. unsure if the comparison would seem strange. Like solving a problem neatly. Every piece has to fit. He studied her. You were not always a seamstress's assistant. No. She did not elaborate. Your father was a clergyman. She looked at him more carefully. Your mother told you. She did. He folded his hands on his knee. She speaks of you often. Eleanor did not quite know what to do with this piece of information. I hope it isn't an inconvenience. My visit. No, said simply, without qualification. Another pause. Have you always lived in London? He asked. No, I came 3 years ago. After my father died, there was nothing to keep me in the village, and she chose the honest word. I didn't want to be kept. He looked at her with that quality of attention she was beginning to recognize, thorough, direct, without the usual social pretense of interest it was not quite feeling. He actually listened when she spoke. It was somewhat disconcerting. That I understand, he said quietly. She looked at him. Before either of them could say anything further, Margaret arrived in a sweep of silk and warm exclamation, and the conversation folded itself away into the ordinary rhythms of the afternoon. But Eleanor thought about it on the bus home. That I understand, said with a weight that meant more than the words. The garden. The following week brought unexpectedly fine weather for October, and Margaret declared they would take tea in the garden. Edward was there when they arrived. Margaret did not seem surprised. Eleanor suspected she was not supposed to seem surprised, and was not, in fact, surprised, which was a different thing entirely. He was looking at the roses, or rather, he was looking at the place where roses had been, a bed of pruned stems awaiting winter. He held his hands behind his back in that way he had, as though keeping them still required a small amount of deliberate intention. He turned when they approached. The camellia is still flowering, Margaret observed. Look, Edward. Don't you think that's rather remarkable for October? Yes, said Edward, who was not looking at the camellia. They sat in the garden chairs. The afternoon was golden and mild, the London sounds muffled by the high walls. Margaret talked about gardens. She had strong opinions about gardens, and Edward poured the tea with the slightly concentrated care of someone who had decided to learn to do small things well and was not entirely natural at it yet. He handed Eleanor's cup to her. Their fingers did not touch. Not quite. She thanked him. He sat down. Miss Voss, Margaret said with studied innocence. You mentioned last week that you used to help your father in his parish garden. I did. Nothing formal, just vegetables mostly. Beans and carrots. He said it kept him honest. She smiled at the memory. He used to say that anything you grow yourself you can't be too proud to eat. Margaret laughed with genuine delight. Edward, beside her, smiled. Not the polite, minimal smile she had seen in the formal rooms. A real one, briefer, quieter, but real. He sounds like a remarkable man, Margaret said. He was very ordinary, Eleanor said. Extraordinarily ordinary. He genuinely believed the most important thing in the world was to be good to the person in front of you, no matter who they were. She paused. He was always finding stray things and returning them to their owners. Said it was just correct. A silence. Not empty, full. Edward was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. The winter gray of his eyes was warmer than usual, or perhaps the October light was playing tricks. He raised you well, he said. He raised me to be inconvenient, Eleanor said, and then went slightly red because she hadn't meant to say it out loud. Margaret burst out laughing. Edward stared at Eleanor for a moment, and then he laughed. It was a low sound, brief, clearly unpracticed, as though he had taken it from a shelf where it had been stored for some time and found it still worked. But it was real. Margaret looked at her son with an expression that Eleanor did not see because she was occupied with looking at her teacup. But the expression on the Dowager Duchess's face, had Eleanor seen it, would have been recognized immediately as the look of a woman who has been waiting for something for a very long time and has just watched it begin. Edward did not return to his study after the garden. He walked. He did this sometimes when something had entered his thoughts and refused to leave. He walked through the house, which was large enough that one could walk considerable distances in it without encountering anyone. He ended up in the portrait gallery, which was empty as always. He stood before the portrait of his father and did not look at it long. Then he stood before the portrait of his grandmother, the woman who had given Margaret that brooch in a carriage on the way to the church. For Margaret. He thought of Eleanor Voss sitting in the garden with the afternoon light on her hair and the teacup in both hands, talking about her father with the ease of someone who keeps grief as a companion rather than an affliction, who had said simply that she had returned the brooch because she knew, and that was enough. He had known, the morning he received her letter, that she was unusual. He had known it more certainly the morning he sat in Mrs. Holt's parlor, and she declined his money without defensiveness and without drama, as though the choice had been so clear to her that it required no performance. He thought of the way she had laughed, surprised by her own laughter, and the way his own laughter had arrived before he had considered letting it. He put his hand on the frame of his grandmother's portrait and thought, with a clarity that was almost physical, of the way Eleanor Voss had said, "I know what it is to lose something that was the last connection to a person. Not performing sympathy, having it, living it." He turned away from the portrait. He was not a romantic man. He had long since made his peace with that, or told himself he had. He was capable, practical, and deeply alone, and had decided that the deep aloneness was a choice rather than a wound. It was tidier that way. But Eleanor Voss had walked into his mother's sitting room with a penny's worth of garnet brooch and turned something. He did not yet know what. He was only aware that something had turned. Lady Sefton was one of the great forces of London society. Small, formidable, and in possession of a guest list that could make or destroy a reputation with the efficiency of a surgeon's knife. She had, this October, decided to host an autumn ball, and the autumn ball was attended by everyone of consequence. Margaret Ashworth attended. Edward attended. Eleanor did not attend, because Eleanor was not the sort of person who was invited to Lady Sefton's autumn balls. This fact was unremarkable. It was entirely in keeping with the way of things, except that Eleanor was there, not as a guest, as a seamstress's assistant. The shop where Eleanor worked had been engaged to make urgent last-minute alterations to 3 of Lady Sefton's gowns, a task that fell to Eleanor because her stitching was the finest in the shop and the deadline was tomorrow morning. She had been admitted through the service entrance at 6 and was shown to a small anteroom off the main hall, where the gowns were laid out waiting. She worked quietly. She was good at being unobtrusive. She had been trained by years of being the vicar's daughter, present at every significant occasion in a village and invisible to anyone who wasn't in need. She did not expect to be noticed. She was noticed. Lady Harworth, not a malicious woman exactly, but possessed of the particular thoughtlessness of people who had never had cause to consider that other people's feelings might matter, came looking for something she had left in the anteroom and found Eleanor there, seated on the floor with a gown spread across her knees. Lady Harworth looked at her. Eleanor looked up, started, and said, "I beg your pardon, my lady. What are you doing here?" Lady Harworth's voice was not unkind, only entirely unused to questioning itself. "Alterations for Lady Sefton, my lady." "You're a seamstress?" "A seamstress's assistant, my lady." Lady Harworth looked at her with the particular expression of someone who has suddenly understood something. "You're the girl," she said. "The one who's been calling at Ashworth House. Margaret Ashworth's." "What is she?" "Her little charity project." Eleanor set her needle down carefully. "I visit the Dowager Duchess, yes. I heard it was something about a brooch." Lady Harworth turned to look at the woman behind her, who Eleanor now saw was Lady Cecilia Hartfield. Beautiful, composed, and the woman who had once been briefly courted by the Duke of Cavendel. "Did you hear that? She found something belonging to the old Duchess, and now she comes to call. Isn't that sweet?" Lady Cecilia looked at Eleanor with an expression of polished disinterest. "What is her name?" "Voss," Lady Harworth said. "The daughter of a country vicar. She works in a shop in Holborn." Eleanor sat very still. "How very industrious," Lady Cecilia said, with a smile that managed to be perfectly pleasant and entirely withering. "I hope she understands that Margaret Ashworth has always been generous with her attention. She collects strays with great enthusiasm." She turned away. "It means nothing, naturally." They left. Eleanor sat on the floor of the anteroom for a moment, holding the gown and breathing carefully. She collects strays. The words sat inside her chest like something cold. Because the genuinely terrible thing, was that she had not thought of it that way. She had not thought of herself as a charity project or a stray. She had allowed herself to believe that the visits meant something. Margaret Ashworth saw her and liked her. That even the Duke, in those quiet afternoons, had been something approaching. She picked up her needle. It meant nothing, naturally. Of course. She was a seamstress's assistant from Holborn, the daughter of a country vicar, with no connections and no fortune and no particular claim on the time of anyone in this house. She had returned a brooch. It was kind. It was over. She had allowed herself to become confused about what it meant, because she had been lonely, and loneliness has a way of making ordinary kindness seem like something more. She finished the alterations with the precision of someone who has put all her feelings into her hands because she cannot afford to let it stay in her chest. She left at 9 o'clock through the service entrance. She did not see Edward Ashworth across the ballroom, among the guests, looking for something in the crowd that he had not known he was looking for until he could not find it. She did not see him. She went home to the lodging house and sat in her room in the dark for a while. Then she wrote a note to Margaret Ashworth, thanking her warmly for her kindness over the past weeks, and explaining that she had been reassigned to a different area of work at the shop and feared her schedule would not permit further visits. It was not exactly a lie, not exactly the truth. She folded it, sealed it, and prepared to send it in the morning. And then she sat on her bed, in her good gray dress which was beginning to show its age, and was quiet with herself for a long time. She had known all along that this could not last. She had simply forgotten, for a few October afternoons, that she had known. Margaret received the note the following morning. She read it once, then again. Then she went to find her son. Edward was in the library. He had been in the library since 7, which Margaret recognized as the place he went when he was thinking about something he didn't want to think about. She sat down across from him without a preamble. "Eleanor has stopped coming," she said. Edward looked up from his papers. His expression did not change. "I see. She sent a note. Very polite. Very final." Margaret set it on the desk between them. "She says her schedule has changed." A pause. "Perhaps it has." "It hasn't." Margaret folded her hands in her lap and looked at her son with the direct gaze that he had spent 35 years trying to hold without flinching. "She was at Lady Sefton's ball last night. Working. She will have heard something or seen something or been made to feel." She stopped. "Edward, look at me." He looked. "That girl," Margaret said quietly, "returned something to me that I had given up for lost. Not a brooch. I know you know that. She returned something I thought people like her no longer were. People who do the right thing without benefit, without audience, without anything except their own conscience telling them it was right." Her voice was very steady. "I love her already. I have loved her since she sat in my sitting room and said I knew, and that was enough. Your grandmother would have loved her. Your father would have loved her." A pause. "I think you already know what I'm going to say next." Edward was very still. "She's a seamstress's assistant," he said. "From Holborn." "She's good," Margaret said. "Simply and entirely good. And that, in my experience, is very much rarer than a family name or a fortune." Silence. "You'd have me court a seamstress's assistant," Edward said. "I would have you not be a fool," his mother replied, with the sharpness of a woman who has been patient for 35 years and is choosing this moment to be done with it. "I would have you look at what is in front of you before you spend the rest of your life looking at what isn't." She stood. She picked up the note and held it out. "The question," she said, "is whether you know what you want." She left the note on the desk and walked out. Edward looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at the chair by the fire. The chair Eleanor had sat in. The chair where she had said, "My father would say it was just correct." He stood. He picked up the note. He put on his coat. Eleanor was preparing to go to work when she heard the knock at the street door. She heard Mrs. Holt's voice, and then a lower voice, and then Mrs. Holt's voice again, very high and slightly strangled. Eleanor looked at the door of her room. She knew that pitch. She had last heard it when the carriage with the Cavendale crest arrived in the street. She sat down on the edge of her bed. Her heart was doing something it had no business doing. A knock at her own door. "Miss Voss." Mrs. Holt's voice, breathless. There is His Grace the—" "Yes," Eleanor said. "Please show him up." She stood, smoothed her dress, the gray one, the only one, and composed her face into the expression of a woman who is perfectly calm and has everything in order and is entirely unmoved by the arrival of an unexpected duke. The expression required a great deal of effort. Edward Ashworth stepped into her room. It was the smallest space she had ever seen him in. Her whole room would have fit twice over into his library. He was careful not to make it feel smaller than it was, which she noticed. He stood near the door, not in the center, not in the way. He looked around once. The narrow bed, the small table, the window with its view of the street, the stack of books by the chair, the mended curtains, and looked at her. "Miss Voss." "Your Grace." She kept her hands still at her sides. "I sent a note to your mother. I hope she received it." She received it. He was looking at her with that quality of attention that had always disconcerted her. "She showed it to me." Eleanor lifted her chin slightly. "I see." "No," he said. "I don't think you do." He stepped forward. One step careful, as though he wasn't entirely sure of the ground. "My mother told me what she thinks," he said. "I'd like to tell you what I think." Eleanor waited. Her heart was not being remotely cooperative. "When I received your letter," he said, "about the brooch, I assumed it was some scheme, some method of access. People do these things. They find pretexts." He stopped. "I went to your lodging house expecting to be managed. I found—" He paused. Something was happening in his face. It was the expression she had seen in the moment he read the engraving. Something opening unwillingly, against its own inclination, like a door being pushed by something stronger than its lock. "I found someone who had done something good," he said quietly, "for its own sake, with no audience and no profit and no expectation of anything at all." He held her gaze. "I have lived 35 years in a world where everything has a price, Miss Voss. Everything is exchanged for something. Friendship for favor, kindness for access, generosity for reputation." A pause. "You paid a penny for a brooch that didn't belong to you and returned it for nothing, because it was right." Eleanor said nothing. Her throat was very tight. "I did not understand how affecting that would be," he said. "I didn't. I'm not." He stopped, and for the first time she saw something she had not expected to see in him. The plain evidence of a man who doesn't know how to say something and is trying anyway. "I'm not easy," he said. "I know that. I have been cold where I should have been present, and absent where I should have been. I know that. My mother has told me for years, and I have not. I haven't." He drew a breath. "My sister died," he said. "Here. In London. Or rather in Yorkshire. She was at Cavendale Park, and the doctor was too far, and I was—" He stopped again. "I was here. And after that, it seemed safer to care about nothing. Because caring about things means you can lose them, and losing—" He closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, Eleanor was looking at him with an expression that he would remember for the rest of his life. No pity. Something more equal than that. Recognition. "I know," she said softly. "About the closing. After my father died, yes, I know." He looked at her. "I came," he said, "because I will not allow you to remove yourself from our lives because some thoughtless woman at a ball said something unkind. I will not allow it." His voice was level, but underneath the level there was something that was not level at all. "My mother loves you. That is not charity. That is not the collection of a stray. That is my mother, who is the best judge of character I have ever known." Recognizing someone worth knowing. Eleanor's eyes were stinging. She refused to blink. "And he stopped, took a breath, looked at her as though the look itself was saying the harder thing. "I find I cannot be indifferent to the possibility of not seeing you again." The room was very quiet. Outside a cart went by. London continued as it always did. "I cannot offer," he started. Don't, Eleanor said. Please don't tell me what you cannot offer. Not yet. He was quiet. You came here, she said. You came to this room. She gestured slightly at the narrow, ordinary room. To tell me that you cannot be indifferent. Her voice was not quite steady. That is already more than I expected. It's not enough, he said. No, she agreed. But it's a beginning. He looked at her. I don't know how to do this, he said honestly. I have been careful for so long. I don't know how to stop being careful. I know, Eleanor said. I've been careful too. Pause. Perhaps we can be careful together. For a while. Until it gets easier. Something happened to his face. The winter gray of his eyes was entirely not winter. Miss Voss, he said. And his voice was lower than usual. Eleanor, her name in his mouth, said as though it mattered. I would like to call on you properly, he said. If you'll allow it. Not because of my mother or the brooch or any other reason. Simply because He seemed to find the words from somewhere deep and difficult. Because I think you are remarkable, and I have been remiss in not saying so. Eleanor stood there in her gray dress in her small room, and she thought of Lady Cecilia's voice. It means nothing naturally, and she thought of her father in his garden, teaching her that the most important thing in the world was to be good to the person in front of you. She thought of a brooch with garnets and the words for Margaret worn into the gold. Yes, she said. You may call. Edward Ashworth released a breath. And then, carefully, slowly, with the caution of a man who has not touched anything fragile in a very long time and is relearning the skill, he reached out and took her hand. He held it for a moment. Just hold it. As though it was the most important thing he had done in years. Eleanor thought that perhaps it was. Society found out, as society always does, and it was Lady Cecilia Hartfield who made it public. She did it elegantly and without apparent malice, which was somehow worse. She mentioned, at Lady Forsyth's card party, that she had heard the most extraordinary thing, that Cavendell had been calling repeatedly at a lodging house in Holborn, that the woman in question was a seamstress's assistant, that the Dowager Duchess was apparently encouraging it. She said it with a smile of polite bewilderment, as though she found the whole thing simply too curious to keep to herself. She said it without saying anything technically unkind. The effect was immediate. The whispers began that evening and were in full circulation by the following morning. Eleanor heard them through the woman at the shop who always knew everything. She heard them clearly and precisely and felt the old cold settle in her chest. This was the thing she had feared. Not for herself. She was her father's daughter and had no particular terror of other people's opinions. But for him. For what it would cost him. She sent a note to Ashworth House. Perhaps it would be wise to be less visible in your calls for the time being. He arrived in person. Again. In her lodging house. In her small room with its mended curtains and its view of the street. I received your note, he said. I know what you thought. He looked at her. You were giving me an excuse. I was giving you an option. I don't want the option. He crossed the room to where she stood by the window and stopped in front of her. Eleanor, I need you to understand something. She met his eyes. I have spent 7 years being careful, he said. Careful of my position, my reputation, the opinion of people I don't particularly like or respect. I have been very, very careful, and it has cost me. He stopped. Started again. My mother has been alone. I have been alone. There has been a great deal of very careful loneliness, and I find I am done with it. The cost will fall on you, she said. On your standing. Yes, he said. And I am telling you I don't care. He said it simply, without drama, as though it were a factual statement that had taken him some time to arrive at and was now simply true. What I care about is this. Right here. In this room. Eleanor looked at him. I am going to call on you, he said. Visibly. Openly. I am going to take you to meet my solicitor on Thursday, because I intend to establish an appropriate arrangement. He paused. Eleanor, I am saying this badly. What I mean is that I intend to court you with every intention of. He stopped again. I have not done this before. Not properly. I am doing it badly. You're doing it honestly. she said softly. He looked at her. Will you let me do it honestly? Eleanor felt the thing in her chest that had been carefully restrained for weeks loosen, almost painfully, like a muscle too long held still. I have one condition, she said. Name it. Never do it for show. Whatever we are, whatever this becomes, don't ever perform it for society's benefit. If you feel it, show me. If you don't, she held his gaze. Tell me honestly and I will manage. I will always tell you honestly, he said, with the quiet certainty of a man making a promise he understands the weight of, even when it's hard, especially then. Then yes, Eleanor said. I will let you do it honestly. He took a breath. Then he reached into his coat pocket and produced something small, held it out on his palm. The brooch. Eleanor looked at it. At him. My mother wanted you to have it, he said. She was very firm about it. I can't. She said, he continued, that her mother gave it to her to give her courage on the day of a great change. She said she cannot think of a better use for it than this. Eleanor stared at the brooch, at the garnets, at the words worn into the back. For Margaret. She wrote something on a card, Edward said. He produced it small in his mother's handwriting, slightly hurried, as though written in enthusiasm. Eleanor took it. She read, *for Eleanor, the only future daughter who could have found this. With all my love, Margaret. *. She felt the tears arrive before she could do anything about them. Oh, she said softly. Oh, that's... Yes, he said. His voice was not entirely steady either. She let him pin the brooch to her collar. His hands, she noticed, were careful. More careful than a man of his bearing might have been expected to be with something so small. When he stepped back, he looked at her for a moment. I know, he said quietly, that I am not easy. I know that this will not be without difficulty. I know that society will talk, and some of them will be unkind, and I will not always handle that with the grace it deserves. He met her eyes. But I will be there. I give you my word. I will not be absent. Eleanor reached up and touched the brooch. The garnets were warm. Someone's love, worn smooth by decades of careful hands. Then we'll manage, she said. He smiled. The real one. The one she had been collecting since that first startled afternoon in the garden. The one that arrived without calculation, without permission, simply because it was true. It was, she thought, rather a good smile. 3 weeks later, Margaret Ashworth held an autumn supper at Ashworth House. It was a small gathering by the Dowager Duchess's standards, 40 guests. And it was, in the way of small gatherings, precisely calculated. Every person present was someone Margaret had chosen with care. Some because they were genuinely good people. Some because they were influential and needed to see what they needed to see. Eleanor wore a gown that Margaret had insisted upon providing. Not as charity, Margaret had said, with a firmness that closed the topic. Deep green silk, simply cut, with no excessive ornamentation. She stood at the top of the stairs beside Edward, and she was aware of the weight of 40 pairs of eyes as they descended. She was also aware of Edward's hand at her back. Steady, present, as he had promised. Lady Cecilia was not among the guests. She had been invited. She had declined, citing another engagement, in a note whose brevity spoke everything. There were murmurs. There always were. Eleanor heard the word seamstress passed from mouth to ear across the room with the efficiency of something practiced. She held herself straight and thought of her father in his village, being good to the person in front of him. Mrs. Hartley is looking at us, she murmured to Edward. Let her, he said. She looks as though she's swallowed something unfortunate. She often does. Eleanor almost laughed. Did not. And then Margaret Ashworth swept forward to greet them, took Eleanor's hands and said, loudly and clearly in the way of someone who has chosen the moment and intends to use it, My dear, you look absolutely beautiful. Come and meet Lord and Lady Ashbridge. I've been telling them about you. Not about Edward. About Eleanor. The room adjusted. It was a small thing. It was somehow everything. Lord Ashbridge was genuinely warm. Lady Ashbridge was curious and found Eleanor interesting rather than threatening. There were others. a professor of botany who had known her father's published letters, a retired judge who appreciated her directness, a young countess who was quietly, carefully unconventional and found in Eleanor a kindred arrangement with the world. By the time supper was served, the seamstress had become simply Miss Voss, or, in Margaret's continued and deliberate usage, my Eleanor. And at the supper table, when the elderly Viscount Carwell made a remark, not unkind, merely patronizing, of the variety that assumes the person being discussed is not quite real, about the interesting origins of the Duke's young lady, Edward set down his glass and said, calmly, looking at the Viscount directly, "Miss Voss is one of the finest people I have ever known. Her father was a better man than most of the men in this room, and she is her father's daughter. I would count it a favor, Carwell, if the people in my mother's house remembered that." Not loud, not angry, said with the absolute assurance of a man who means exactly what he says and is done with saying anything else about it. The silence that followed was brief. It was enough. Eleanor, seated beside him, reached under the table and found his hand. He held it, beneath the tablecloth, out of sight, privately, as she had asked him, not for show. For them. The announcement appeared in the papers on the 15th of November. The Duke of Cavendel to Miss Eleanor Voss of London. There was no of specifically. There was no family name of significance, no estate attached, no title preceding. Just Eleanor Voss of London, unadorned. The papers were divided. Some were incredulous. Some were dismissive. One, rather thoughtfully, wrote that the Duke of Cavendel had always done exactly as he pleased and seemed to have found someone worth pleasing. Margaret cut that one out and kept it. The wedding was in February. Small. The chapel at Cavendel Park, snow outside, candles within, Margaret in the front row with her hand pressed to the brooch on her collar. She had insisted Eleanor return it for the ceremony, saying it was its proper place. Edward held Eleanor's hands when he made his vows and said them as though they were the clearest truth he had ever spoken. Eleanor said hers and looked at him steadily and meant every word. Spring arrived at Cavendel Park with enthusiasm, as though it had been waiting for permission. Eleanor learned the house slowly, in the way she had always learned things, through careful attention, through questions, through finding what needed doing and doing it without announcement. She made mistakes. She learned from them. She found allies among the staff in unexpected places, and she found that the tenants, who had been wary, became something else once they understood that the new Duchess intended to know their names. She also found, in the East Wing, a long-neglected garden. "It was my grandmother's," Edward said when she mentioned it. "She grew roses." "What kind?" "I don't remember. I was very young when she died." He paused. "She was the one who gave my mother the brooch." Eleanor stood in the untended garden, looking at the old stone beds, the gnarled remnants of plants that had been magnificent and would be again with attention. She thought of a woman who had pressed a piece of gold into her daughter's hands in a carriage on the way to a church and said for courage, "I'd like to restore it," she said. "Then restore it," Edward said, as simply as that. Took the whole of spring. Eleanor dug, consulted books, consulted gardeners, got her hands consistently covered in soil and her dress consistently inadequate for the task. Edward appeared in the garden with increasing frequency. He did not pretend to be helpful about the planting. He admitted, no idea what he was doing, but he brought her tea and asked questions and listened to the answers with his full attention, which was, she had found, the thing he did best. And sometimes he simply sat on the low wall and watched her work, and she looked up and found him watching, and neither of them said anything because nothing particularly needed to be said. It was a Sunday in May when the first roses opened. Eleanor was in the garden at dawn. She was always in the garden at dawn now. It had become the favorite part of her day, and the light came low and golden across the beds and caught the petals, white and blush and deep red, opening one by one in the May morning. She knelt beside the first red one, put her fingers very gently against the outermost petal. She heard footsteps on the gravel path. Edward sat down beside her on the ground, beside her, not near her, in his good coat on the dewy grass without apparent concern. He looked at the rose. She would have loved this, he said. Eleanor knew he meant both women. His grandmother, who had planted roses and given garnets for courage, and his sister Philippa, who had wanted only not to be alone. She would, Eleanor agreed. Silence, the good kind. The inhabited kind. I've been thinking, Edward said. About the garden in London. Eleanor looked at him. The kitchen garden? I thought it might be worth improving. There's a bed near the south wall that gets full light. You've been looking at the south wall. You've been improving every garden you encounter. I thought I might, he paused. I thought I might help. Eleanor sat back on her heels and looked at her husband. Her husband who, 7 months ago, had been a man with winter in his eyes and walls built so high she had only seen the top of them. Who had learned, slowly, carefully, not without difficulty, to be present. Who still struggled sometimes. Who still had days when the old caution arrived and he went quiet and she waited and didn't push. Who was still not easy, and who was more than she had expected him to be, and less than easy and more than enough. You'll need gloves, she said. And old clothes. I have old clothes. You have clothes that cost more than everything I owned in Holborn. Then I'll ruin them, he said simply. For the garden. Eleanor laughed. He looked at her when she laughed. He always did. As though it was still, slightly, a thing that startled him. As though he hadn't quite gotten used to it and wasn't entirely sure he wanted to. Because not being used to it meant every time felt like the first time. Cavendel, she said. Yes. I love you. He looked at her for a moment. The May morning all around them. The roses opening. The light doing exactly what it should. Eleanor, he said. I have not told you nearly often enough. He reached over and brushed a streak of earth from her cheek with his thumb. The way he always did. As though the gesture were part of a language he had learned and became fluent in without noticing. I love you, he said. Entirely. Without reservation. I loved you before I knew what to call it. And I will love you long after it needs a name. Eleanor held his gaze. Then she leaned forward and kissed him, in the garden, in the May morning, with her hands still covered in earth and the roses opening around them. He kissed her back with the sureness of a man who knows exactly where he is and has no intention of being anywhere else. When they pulled apart, she rested her forehead against his. I found something at a market once, she said. He smiled, the real one. I know. A penny's worth of garnet. She touched the brooch at her collar. She wore it often now with Margaret's blessing. The garnets warm in the morning light. Asterisk for Margaret, asterisk, he said softly. For Margaret, she agreed. And now, I suppose? She sat back and looked at the rose garden, at the house behind them, at the life assembled improbably and carefully and honestly from very small beginnings. For all of us, 1 year later, Margaret Ashworth was in the garden. Not the rose garden, the kitchen garden, which Eleanor had also restored and which now produced, with what Margaret called suspicious abundance, an impressive quantity of beans, carrots, and exactly the kind of cheerful disorder that would have delighted Eleanor's father. She was seated on the low bench in the morning sun with a cup of tea and a profound personal satisfaction, watching Eleanor and Edward on the far side of the garden. They were attempting to construct a frame for the climbing roses, a task that Edward, for all his considerable capabilities, was not apparently finding straightforward. Eleanor was directing. He was listening, then trying again, then being directed again. They were laughing, not performing happiness. Having it. Margaret set her teacup down and looked at the brooch at her collar. The garnets caught the light. She thought of her own mother in the carriage, pressing the brooch into her hands. For courage. She thought of an ordinary woman in an extraordinary moment, standing at a second-hand seller's cloth in a market, turning a small piece of gold over and over in her hands, reading the words engraved on the back, and choosing to do the right thing for no reason except that it was right. She thought of her son's face the morning she had said, "The question is whether you know what you want." She thought of the way he looked now, across the kitchen garden, trying to hold a frame upright at Eleanor's direction and clearly enjoying being told he was doing it wrong. She had spent 11 years believing the brooch was lost. She had spent 7 years believing her son was, in a different and more terrible way, also lost. She had been wrong about both. Things lost, she thought, were not always gone. Sometimes they were simply waiting in unexpected places, for someone with the patience to look and the honesty to return them. Margaret picked up her tea. Across the garden, Eleanor called something that made Edward laugh. Really laugh, with his head back and no composure in it at all. Margaret smiled. "Well done, mother," she said softly, to the woman in the carriage with the brooch. "Well done, indeed. If the story moved you, if Eleanor and Edward stayed with you past the final word, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. These stories are written with love, to reach hearts that need them. Tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from. It is always a wonder to discover how far these stories travel. Asterisk. Until next time. May courage find you when you need it most, and may love arrive in the most unexpected of places.